What if our brains aren't actually designed to make us happy? When Dr. Austin Perlmutter says our brains and bodies are not so concerned about our happiness, they're optimized for survival, he challenges us to reconsider everything we know about mental health. I'm Paul F. Austin, and this is the Psychedelic Podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Perlmutter, a board-certified internal medicine physician, New York Times bestselling author, and pioneering researcher at the intersection of inflammation, brain health, and psychedelics. In our conversation today, we explore how our modern environment constantly triggers our body's danger signals, creating chronic inflammation that profoundly affects our mental state. What makes this conversation so valuable is Austin's ability to translate complex neurobiology into practical insights, explaining how psychedelics can unstick harmful brain patterns by working through multiple biological pathways, not just serotonin, and why sustainable lifestyle practices are essential to maintain these benefits. I first met Austin at the Eudaimonia Summit, where he spoke on a panel about psychedelics, and I was immediately struck by his integrative approach to medicine. He is conducting fascinating research on how ayahuasca affects our epigenetics and microbiome, potentially explaining why a single psychedelic experience can produce years of benefits. I think you'll appreciate his balanced perspective. He's neither a psychedelic evangelist nor a skeptic, but instead offers a thoughtful framework for understanding when these powerful tools might be necessary and how to maximize their benefits. All right, that's it for now. Let's get into my conversation with Dr. Austin Perlmutter. Austin, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Paul. Great to be here.
So tell us a little bit about your path. I mean, we're about the same age. You might be a few years older than I am. You look like I don't know how much longevity medicine you do, but I would say you're probably 36, 37. You've written a New York Times bestselling book. You're an internal medicine physician. You're involved in a lot of projects. Just talk to us a little bit about what keeps you alive and vital and healthy. What are some of the practices that you commit to and are consistent with that help you to do all the work that you're doing in the world?
Yeah, well, I think we're in an interesting time in medicine in general, and especially around longevity, lifestyle medicine, because there's so much amazing science coming out, and we're learning about the pathways that keep us healthy and that can potentially prolong our lifespan, improve mental health. But what I personally do is I just try to do the basics well. And what I mean by that is, despite all the research we have, and it is compelling research, the best data we have to be healthy, happy, and live a long life is to do the basics well. So I try to sleep well. I try to move each day. I try to eat mostly healthy food, real food, minimally processed food. I try to prioritize relationships, mindfulness, some time in nature. And the reality of it is that when you do those things well, those are the best things a person can do. So I can walk you through the specifics of my day. How much weight do I lift when I go to the gym on the squat rack, or what specific foods I like, olive oil and salmon. But what I mostly try to do is just do a pretty good job with the basics each day. And I find that that's the most sustainable route for me personally, and based on the science, to optimize towards all the variables that we care about.
Now, when is it that sort of psychedelics entered your picture? Because I imagine as a board-certified internal medicine doc, they probably didn't teach you much about psychedelics in graduate school. We know only in the last few years have psychedelics become more of a hot topic of interest, really, since Michael Pollan's book came out in 2018. When did the topic or the concept of psychedelics sort of enter your picture and start to influence you?
I think, I guess medical school was the first major foray into understanding psychedelics at a very cursory level. So I went to medical school in Miami. Miami had then, and I think still has, a relatively robust kind of psychedelic culture. The agent of choice would be something like MDMA, specifically in the context of the electronic dance music scene that was, and I think is still popular there. And so we would discuss people coming into our hospital with what was described as ecstasy-related or MDMA-related brain issues. And I think that's just a good representation of what was seen as a psychedelic. It is a drug that alters mental state, that has no really redeeming value other than a short-term high, and that should be kind of looped in with cocaine and other drugs with very well-known negative side effects. So there was that, a couple of case reports that we would discuss. There was very little at that time discussion about the kind of redeeming value of molecules like psilocybin. Very little being done to explore MDMA, a lot of the other psychedelics that we're talking about now, ibogaine and others just weren't on the radar whatsoever. And so that was the case in my medical school. And I mean, I guess that was right up to around 2015. In residency, it was in Portland, psychedelics were seen as a bit more of kind of the this is outside of training, seen as something more akin to a way to grow yourself mentally, which I think was kind of concurrent with a shift in the overall culture, especially in my age demographic, of people using psychedelics, not just kind of counterculturally, but also as a way to grow as humans, to unlock, to start to explore expanded potential. And it was also at that same time, and I guess in part there was an overlap because it was fueling what was happening recreationally, a lot more research being published in top tier journals, looking at the potential benefit of molecules like psilocybin for specific conditions. So the research around psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression or end-of-life depression was starting to be popularized. And again, these were in large and well-respected medical journals. So there started to be a bit more of an understanding in medical centers. And I think Portland being a bit more of a progressive center in terms of outlook on these types of things was a little more open to this probably than many institutions. But since it was coming out of Hopkins and coming out of NYU, it was hard to deny that this was something that was actually changing the field. I became interested personally in this, both as a function of trying to better understand my mind, improve my mental health, improve my kind of outlook on life, and also because I had the very, very explicit realization that everything that I was doing in medicine was going towards a surrogate for what really mattered. What I mean by that is after working with people at the end of their lives, so in the ICU or in the hospital bed who were getting to those last stages, and in working with people who were nowhere near the end of their lives but had just kind of lost their desire to keep moving forward in a meaningful way. Just life wasn't all that meaningful anymore. They weren't enjoying things anymore. Or even those who were doing relatively well, but who were having trouble with doing the basics. So the people I would tell you, you got to start eating healthy or you have to start exercising. The block was that their mental state, their brain state was not in a space that was conducive to health, to wellness. And when I looked at all of the available research around what are the interventions, what are the tools we have available to bring people's brain state towards a healthier place, not just for the moment, but for long-term decision-making, for long-term mental health, psychedelics emerged as one of the most powerful potential tools in that space. Kind of a portal, a way, what I described as to kind of get the stuck out, to undo or rewire pathways related to psychological cognitive stuckness. And that's really what psychedelics seem to do. So it was a combination of my personal experience with psychedelics and seeing the potential impact that they could have, both in terms of the published literature on humans, but also mechanistically on what it could do to wire people's brains for success, that made me get so excited about this potential. What does it represent for humans? What does it represent specifically within the realm of, I guess what I would call neuroscience or even neuroeconomics, which is the field of understanding human decision-making at a biological level. But I guess at a very basic kind of level, it would be understanding that what drives humans to success or failure is their mental health. And the tools we have available for mental health right now are inadequate. And psychedelics represent potentially one of the most powerful tools that could bias our brains towards more success in that domain. So that led to a lot of kind of my own research, and then starting to speak on this topic. Now working on a collaborative with a team of people where we're exploring the effects of ayahuasca. We can talk about this more later, but on specific pathways related to gene expression and the microbiome, to try to better interrogate what exactly is happening when we use these molecules. But it's a combination of curiosity and just the knowledge that this information has to be developed, because right now our solutions are so inadequate.
So there's a lot there, and what I want to sort of go deeper into is talking about the sort of unstucking the brain. That's not an actual word, but getting the brain unstuck, right? And I'm curious to hear your perspective, especially as someone who's on the cutting edge of longevity and lifestyle interventions and environmental factors, which we're learning more about every day with the recent fires in Los Angeles and microplastics and
Mhm.
noise and air pollution. There's a lot of environmental factors. From your understanding, what is the relationship between psychedelic interventions, so working with ayahuasca, taking psilocybin mushrooms, maybe doing MDMA assisted therapy, and lifestyle interventions like getting better sleep and eating healthier and being more mindful of how clean our environment is? How do you see the relationship between those two working to help get the brain unstuck and optimize our mental health?
Yeah, I mean, this is the question. The first place I would start with is to ask people why they think, act, and feel the way they think, act, and feel. I think there's a lot that can be understood from simply posing the question and sitting with it for a moment. So why do you think the way you do? Why do you feel the way you do? Why do you act the way you do? And despite all the science, I think that most of us, including many academics, doctors, and otherwise, still see this world in this separated, kind of bifurcated way in which we have biology over here, and then we have our identity, our mental state over here, as though they don't communicate. And so that would mean if you make a healthy decision or an unhealthy decision, that's a reflection of your identity, but not a reflection of your biology. That if you feel a certain way, you're angry at somebody, then that is a you thing, not a biology thing. And the explicit reality is that the way you think, act, and feel is a dynamic reflection of the structure and function and connections between your brain cells and the way that your brain is set up. And so if we start there and say that that helps us to understand all the things that are most important in our lives, then we could ask, well, what are the systems that influence our brain biology, and how do various interventions act on those systems? And so whether that intervention is consuming a certain dietary pattern, the ketogenic diet, let's say, or using a pharmaceutical drug, an antidepressant, an SSRI, or looking at something like a psychedelic molecule, all of these interventions can be seen through the lens of what they do to our brain biology. Now, if we're talking about neurobiology, brain biology, it is a complicated and incredibly large world of information. The pathways that are most relevant are going to be some that people have heard about in the context of brain science, like neurotransmitters. Most people know neurotransmitters are involved in brain state. But some of these are pathways that we've historically thought about as only relevant in the periphery, in the rest of our bodies. So, for example, hormones, the endocrine system, metabolism. People think about that in the context of, well, I don't want to get, overweight. I don't want to get diabetes. But what does that have to do with what happens in the brain? Actually, a whole lot. Similarly, in an area that I've spent a lot of time researching and thinking about, the immune system in the body, we think about as, well, did I get a flu? Did I get a cold? Was there an issue in terms of some sort of a gut microbiome problem that caused me to develop GI symptoms? But we don't necessarily think about the role of the immune system, and in particular inflammation, in terms of what it does within the brain. And it turns out that the immune system and inflammation within the brain play a massive role in shaping how we think. Just to put that into context, if you take a healthy person and you give them a molecule from a bacterium that increases inflammation, they will start feeling depressed right after they receive the molecule. So the immune system in the brain is a dynamic change agent in terms of how we think, how we act, and how we feel. Similarly, the vascular system. So basically, our blood vessels are incredibly important to our brain because our brain uses a disproportionately high number of molecules of oxygen and needs a disproportionately high amount of glucose. The only way it gets there is through the blood vessels. So having healthy blood vessels and a vascular system within the brain, very important to brain function, but we don't always think about it unless a person has a stroke or another overt issue. And the last example I would give is a class of molecules called neurotrophins, the best example being brain-derived neurotrophic factor. These are molecules that can augment, that can change levels of neuroplasticity, the rewiring of our brain. And in particular, we know that psychedelics seem to act on many of these pathways, but definitely this neuroplasticity pathway, in part by increasing molecules by like brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Bottom line to what I'm saying here is there are a number of different pathways that act within the brain, change our basically lived experience. And many of these pathways, I guess all of them, have something to do with what happens in our bodies. And so what changes these things? Well, it's the food that we eat, it's the experiences we have, it's exercise, it's sleep, it's the gut microbiome, it is the air that we breathe and the quality of that air, and it is more explicit interventions that we maybe think about as immediately influencing the brain. For example, psychedelics, or for example, other pharmaceutical agents, but it all converges on these same pathways.
This is good. So I want to give you some of my speculation, and I would love for you to sort of like unpack it or critique it or tell me where I'm wrong or kind of help me understand, because I'm much more of a big picture guy. So when I teach our practitioners or other classes, I will often talk about some things around the gut-brain axis, right? So one of the things that I'll communicate is that what a lot of folks don't realize is 90% of our serotonin receptors are actually in the gut. And that because psychedelics have a direct impact on serotonin receptors, they're helping to manage inflammation or chronic inflammation in the gut, which has a direct relationship to how inflammation shows up in the brain as well. And that because when we lower chronic inflammation within our system, it allows for greater neuroplasticity because that noise, that static is no longer present, which allows the brain to grow and adapt and learn, become unstuck from old ways or step into new patterns and new behaviors. And so you can tell it's sort of a mishmash. It's speculative as a lot of the clinical research that we know about is brain specific. There has been a little bit on inflammation from Charles Nichols out of LSU. He's shown that DOI has an anti-inflammatory impact, which I think is interesting. But kind of help me understand what I just talked through. What might be off about that? What might not be thorough enough in that? Where might there be gaps in that sort of line of thinking?
I mean, I think the outcome of what you're saying is all correct. It's some combination of these pathways that leads to benefit to the brain. Is it a little more immunity here, a little more neuroplasticity there? It's unclear. The gut-brain axis, basically the idea that there is a bidirectional interaction between the central nervous system and what happens in your GI tract, is a well-established component of modern medicine. So there's nobody really pushing back on the significance of it, in that it definitely shapes who we are, it definitely shapes how we behave. The question as to the specifics of the pathways, it's still a little bit debated. I mean, I would say, just from my perspective, it's easy to say something like, well, majority of your serotonin's in your gut. Serotonin is the neurotransmitter that goes down in depression. Therefore, gut health is the only thing that matters for depression. And you can, start punching holes in it. For example, a publication 2 years ago basically demonstrated that serotonin is not responsible for depression, at least as conventionally understood, because levels of serotonin don't go up in people who are improving. And also, it's not clear necessarily that SSRIs and other serotonin targeting drugs actually raise serotonin in a way that explains the mechanism. Similarly, the serotonin in the gut doesn't reach the brain directly, right? So it can't go through the blood-brain barrier. So even if the majority of serotonin exists in the gut, it doesn't mean that it's getting into the brain in any meaningful way. But what you brought up, which is true, is that the serotonin in the gut influences local immune cells within the gut. And we have a huge percentage of our immune system located in the gut, where it listens to and learns from the information from the outside world. So we're going to just do a quick moment here of immunity information, because I think this is really important. Most people, myself included, learned about the immune system through the lens of a defense system specifically against pathogens. We would say you need a strong immune system so you don't get a cold, and you need to boost your immune system with vitamin C. And if you get, a splinter, your immune system is going to fight it off. You're going to have localized inflammation. And that's really the role of the immune system. So you want to boost it so it's stronger. And if it's low, you're going to be at the mercy of getting an infection. But the immune system does way, way more than that. And it's much more helpful to think about it as basically it's an information gathering and response system. So one of the things it does in response to a infection is it triggers a cascade that helps to fight off the infection. But it also, at a much lower level, is perpetually scanning the outside environment and translating that data into information that basically goes across our bodies. So This helps to explain certainly conditions like autoimmunity and allergy, right? It is detecting data and it is mounting a response to it. It's not necessarily an infectious response, but it also, more importantly, helps us to understand why dysregulation of the immune system at a chronic smoldering level, which really is most well conceptualized through the lens of inflammation, is tethered to higher risk for depression, for dying earlier, for age-related diseases, for metabolic dysfunction. And what the immune system has happened, and really the biggest threat to the immune system in the modern world, is perpetually detecting a low-level danger signal. Now, that danger signal can be because of, for example, molecules coming through the gut that really shouldn't be coming through the gut. Lipopolysaccharide is a good example. So when the gut becomes more permeable, we get more LPS or lipopolysaccharide. That triggers low-level chronic inflammation, which then damages mental health and damages cognition. But we can also trigger low-level immune activation through what we consume through our eyes and through our ears. Because remember, the immune system is really a sensory system that is detecting information from the outside world. So if you're consuming a lot of stressful content, you're actually telling the immune system there's danger. And so your immune system will rev up to a low level of chronic inflammation. If the air we breathe has a lot of air pollution in it, that also revs up the immune system and leads to chronic inflammation. All of these things converge because what happens is when the immune system has chronic low-level inflammation within the brain, our risk for developing depression, dementia, a number of other neurodegenerative conditions, even PTSD seems to go up. So the last thing I'll say on this is, we can typically look at this, historically we look at this as, well, the body is messing up when the immune system messes up. Inflammation is damaging our bodies, or the immune system is causing autoimmunity or allergies. But there's another way of approaching this, which is that the immune system and really the body as a whole is only responding in the best way it knows how to the information it's receiving. And so if we're living and breathing and existing in a world where we're perpetually receiving these danger signals, it is not strange that the body would respond in a way that maybe makes our lives lower quality, but probably has a protective mechanism for survival, at least in the short term. So let's layer all that into the psychedelic piece of it. I know that listeners, watchers of this podcast have probably heard other guests talk about some of the mechanisms around what psychedelics do. Historically, and even I think right now, if I was to go back to medical training and learn about what psychedelics do, there is this focus on the serotonin receptor within the brain. And so 2A receptor, but also some other receptors involved in serotonin, basically regulation. And we think about that as important because it correlates with the psychedelic experience. So when you look at humans and you see, is this receptor bound? Basically, is it activated? The level or the degree to which it is activated correlates with the intensity of the psychedelic experience, the alteration in state of consciousness. And that is important, right? We've seen all these studies showing that the degree of the mystical experience correlates with some of the benefits, but that's just our conscious experience of what is happening at a molecular level within neuroplastic pathways, within the neuroimmune system, within these other metabolic systems and otherwise within our brains. And so when we consume a psychedelic molecule, it is actually a short-term stressor on our bodies. And you can see pretty directly cortisol, for example, going up when people use psychedelics. But long-term, what it's doing potentially here is it's decreasing our body's kind of exposure to danger signals by reprogramming some of these pathways. And so as you've alluded to, there's some data suggesting that psychedelics, psilocybin and others, and LSD may regulate the immune system in some way. This is still very early stuff, but it also may regulate metabolism. It also may regulate other pathways. And so part of what it may be doing is showing our body that there is an opportunity to not be as reactive to some of these danger signals through a number of these different pathways to, in many ways, improve mental health. And to kind of, bring all this down to earth, what we're saying here is, or what I'm saying is, if we think of the body and we think of our biology as a response system in which the immune system, being a good example, is simply decoding the data from the outside world and trying to make sense of it in a way that from its perspective is adaptive, but doesn't actually lead to long-term benefit to our mental health, then maybe one of the things that psychedelics do is through the immune system and these other pathways help to bring the body and bring our brains back to a state of relative balance where we're better able and even more resilient against some of these threats from the outside world. So the danger signal goes down and our ability to enjoy life, which again is not, it's not what our body necessarily cares about most, but it's maybe what we care about most, that becomes more available because of some of these molecular pathways that I've just described.
Another framing for it, and a word you didn't mention, maybe around the autonomic nervous system. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but we do spend a lot of time in this, I hear it all the time, the sympathetic state, the fight or flight, right? That our biology is still, 10, 20, 30,000 years ago. And it feels like we're getting chased by a saber-toothed tiger every day because of the stresses of modernity. And so part of what psychedelics often do for individuals is they allow these individuals to dramatically, because of the impact of hormesis, this hormesis that psychedelics are having, allow them to dramatically shift into this parasympathetic state, the rest and digest. And then basically as part of integration over the next 2 to 3 weeks, as part of that critical learning period and the brain being more plastic, find what is that balance then, what is that metabolic balance or what is that nervous system balance where we can still show up and do the things that we need to do. Because if we're too much rest and digest, we're not getting anything done. And this is sort of like the classic hippie trope, right? But we don't want to be constantly stressed, because when our body is constantly stressed, as you talked about, we are really inflamed as a result of that, which has all these negative consequences.
Yeah, that's completely right. So one important point is we don't want to have no stress. Without stress, we would never get off the couch. And if you think about when you wake up in the morning, what is it that compels you to get out of bed? It may be that you feel a little bit of stress about work, where you need to care for the kids, or your dog is waking you up, as in the case of my life every morning. Or you're hungry, or you have to go to the bathroom. Some level of stress is necessary, some level of a delta, a gap between what you're doing in that moment and what you should or want to or need to be doing. That's the stress that we need to move through life. And it's been shown time and time again that in order to thrive and in order to have good cognition, you need some degree of psychological stress. It's one of the reasons why people tend to have much higher rates of diseases right after they retire, when all those stressors go away, but it's kind of replaced with an absence of a need to kind of, keep the body moving and regulated in that way. So you're correct in that psychedelics do seem to act on the stress pathways by increasing stress in the short run, but over time changing the way that we kind of see and integrate stressors into our lives. I'll come back to a point I made before because it's again relevant to this, which is our bodies and our brains are not so concerned about our happiness. That is not the outcome they're optimized towards. Our bodies and our brains would like for us to survive and pass on our genes, and everything else is secondary to that. So simultaneously, or in conjunction with this, we see that our modern world is set up not in a way that is optimized for health or happiness, but rather that is optimized towards a whole bunch of other variables. GDP, basically anything that benefits the large entities that get to control the majority of what happens in commerce and in government. And so when we bathe our brains in this soup of the modern world, where everything is optimized for things that are out of sync with our mental health is going to suffer. That is the expectation. It is not strange to me that despite all of the modern technologies and breakthroughs in medicine, we still have hundreds of thousands or hundreds of millions of people in the world who are experiencing depression, anxiety, and over a billion, probably several billion people who are experiencing such overwhelming levels of psychological stress that it directly compromises their quality of life. And importantly, these trends persist in countries like the United States, where overall metrics in terms of access to healthcare, overall wealth, and these other just kind of basic Maslow's pyramid type of things have actually improved over the last decades. But mental health is not better. Why is that the case? It's because it's not actually optimized towards mental health. It is other variables. So putting this together, what we're saying here is your brain is not, its primary focus is not your mental health, and you're living in a world in which the primary focus is not your mental health. So it requires taking on this kind of understanding, which is if you want to have good mental health in a world in which poor mental health is kind of accepted and is optimized as the default, and you have to understand that your biology is not necessarily focused on good mental health, then changes must be made. And so what I think is interesting about psychedelics, it is the one of very few interventions where you can gain the psychological clarity to see what I just described and feel it in real time, where you can see through this veneer, this facade of what society imposes on us in terms of what is important, and appreciate that so much of it has nothing to do with what is good for your mental health. And from that, potentially, this is not a universal truth, but from that, potentially, people can start to make long-term decisions that are actually in sync with what is good for them. The liability in this, from my perspective, is if you don't actually apply the correct way of doing psychedelics as per the clinical trials. For example, if you go into a clinic and get a high-dose psychedelic for an hour and then they send you on your way and you go right back to the life you had before, you don't actually create the opportunity to wire in these more healthy pathways. Because as I've said before, what psychedelics do is they act on these same pathways that healthy diet or exercise or sleep or stress reduction therapies like mindfulness and meditation act on. And so while it can be incredibly powerful to have a single dose of a psychedelic in terms of creating perspective, what I think the goal here is to ask this question of, well, what is it that psychedelics do in terms of providing us with this insight? What pathways do they act on? And how do we sustain that long term? And the last thing I'll say on this, where I think there is kind of a direct correlate. So right now, 2025, we have seen an incredible surge in the use of a specific category of pharmaceuticals called GLP-1 agonists and associated drugs, Ozempic, Wegovy. These are drugs that act on a pathway called the GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide-1 pathway, to decrease appetite, increase feelings of satiety. People are losing a lot of weight. And so the question then would be, well, should everyone be on a GLP-1 agonist? Because it seems to work. And one of the answers, and an answer that I think is where I would stand, is what we recognize here is that there is an incredible delta between good metabolic health and where people are right now, which is why these drugs work so well. But we need to ask what else acts on those pathways. And similarly with psychedelics, I think psychedelics can be an amazing tool, but it still should promote and basically compel us to ask the question of what is it that they are doing that we can sustain through lifestyle? So I'm worried sometimes that people look at psychedelics as the panacea without asking, how did the setup get to the point where they were necessary? And how after the use can we sustain the benefits by looking at lifestyle interventions that act on the same pathways?
Yeah, that's really well said. And one thing that's coming up as part of this is I think of a lot of the ibogaine providers or iboga providers, and this is a very extreme example and illustrates the point well. When you have people who are addicted to opiates or heroin and they go down and do ibogaine or iboga, oftentimes they will go first into a recovery home for maybe 2 months or 3 months or 6 months before they go back into their normal environment that they came from. Because what they found is if people just go down and they work with iboga or ibogaine, they interrupt the pattern of addiction, they get better. If they go back into that same environment, there's a much higher likelihood that they will fall back into the same patterns of addiction. And so even though that's an extreme case, I think it's relevant and true as we look at the medicalization of psychedelics, that if people are just going into a clinic, they're getting treatment for, depression, they take a single dose of psilocybin and they just go back into their same life that they had come from, it's not going to be the same level of dramatic impact as if they, maybe go down to the Amazon for 2 weeks and they work with ayahuasca at a nice retreat center where they're well supported and they have a chance to be in the jungle and they have a chance to sort of detox and reset and be in community before then they go either back home or maybe even elsewhere. And I think that's part of one of the big problems that isn't talked about enough in the psychedelic space is if we don't change the set and setting, of our sort of mundane lives, then psychedelics are not going to have nearly the impact that we expect them to have on mental health.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. I mean, there's great research around heroin use and people coming back from Vietnam, and there's research in animal studies showing the same kind of thing, which is the incredible power of community, right, to change behavior. The Harvard study of adult development is the longest running study that's looked at mental health, and what they find is the best predictor of human wellness is the strength of our connections with other people. And so I think you can kind of look at all of the things that we're describing through the lens of connectivity. Does it improve connection? There's a certain subset of people that don't really require a lot of social engagement and connection. That is the very small minority of people. It's kind of like, people sometimes tell me, hey, I feel like I only need 4 hours of sleep. Do you think that's true? I said, well, statistically, it's incredibly improbable. There's a certain subset of the population, a very small subset, that seems to get by and make do with a few hours of sleep a night. But most people need, let's say, 8 hours of good sleep each night. And I think that this is, again, one of the liabilities with many of the things in modern medicine, but especially as we get to psychological state, which is it is easier to go with a targeted pathway effect and to say, look, this person's experiencing depression. I don't know exactly the reasons how they got there. Maybe somebody died in their life. Maybe they lost their job. What does that signify? I'm not sure. But at the end of the day, they are testing positive for major depression. And so the algorithm that I trained with tells me that the next step is either psychotherapy or pharmaceuticals, SSRIs, SNRIs, or a combination of those two things. Now, the psychotherapy is interesting because you can't actually talk through and understand kind of how you got to that point. But the pharmaceuticals are predicated on the idea that anybody who is depressed has an issue with a pathway that is targeted by these drugs. And yet we know that, maybe if you're conservative, 2/3 of people really get significant therapeutic benefit from conventional antidepressants, even after multiple rounds of therapy, which would indicate that it's not the single pathway that helps us to understand why people become depressed. Similarly, on the back end, what we see is incredible high rates of side effects, which means that, if 50% of people are getting side effects from medication, that medication is nowhere near as targeted to the specific pathway we thought it was. So then putting that into the context of psychedelics, how do psychedelics work exactly? Who knows? But what is the outcome of some sort of combination of these pathways is that certain subsets of people who come in with various mental health issues and increasingly other issues as well seem to receive a benefit. But the question that we must ask in America especially is, why are so many people getting to the point where that's the intervention necessary? People use this line, which is high blood pressure isn't necessarily a hypertensive drug deficiency. It's not like your cholesterol issue is because you weren't put on Crestor. It's because of something happening in your biology that leads you to the point where the next best step is to use a pharmaceutical. And some people would say, oh, we need more psychedelics early maybe to prevent the issues from happening. But I think the main point here is the connection that comes from psychedelics in terms of us feeling integrated with ourselves, the people around us, with nature quite often. So psilocybin in particular increases connectedness to nature. Those are the things that predict good mental health. And you don't have to use a psychedelic to get there. But when we've become so distant from it, that's why psychedelics are interesting, because you can go from waking up in the morning feeling very disconnected to a few hours later, not only cognitively understanding the disconnect, but feeling the connection, right? And so it immediately removes the veil, and it gives us an opportunity for that perspective. And yet, the idea that we should just every week be macro dosing because that's the way to stay connected feels out of sync to me. Because just like a pharmaceutical, my goal would be to say, look, this may be necessary right now, but the goal here is to find sustainable lifestyle changes that allow you to feel balanced and connected without having to rely on an incredibly potent regulator of these systems in the body. Because there are side effects, not saying that they outweigh the benefits, but here's an interesting question maybe for you. If you could be in a psychedelic state for 24 hours a day, would you choose that? Because for me, I would say, look, that's really interesting. It provides incredible perspective for me. But the goal is to take those learnings and bring them back to the world that we really live in, even though this feels like, the fake world a lot of the time. And in order to do that, you need to be able to have the experience of what it is to be disconnected from that all-knowing source that can come from psychedelic use. So I know I said a lot of things there. I'll let you jump in on anything that's interesting to you.
Well, and in some ways, again, please correct me on this, but it feels like those who maybe have schizophrenia or a diagnosis of schizophrenia or psychosis are living in a psychedelic state at times, 24 hours a day. And we've seen the outcomes of that and what that can represent. So I think this understanding of the hormetic effect being like, the way that I talk about it is like when you go to the dentist. You might go to the dentist once every 6 months. It could be that an intervention once every 3 to 6 months is necessary in the beginning stages if someone has treatment-resistant depression or they have, high levels of anxiety. But at the end of the day, a lot of the intention is to ground that in lifestyle practices and behaviors. Now, microdosing is interesting. These low doses are interesting because those are what I sort of refer them to as these can be done every now and then in between these high doses as a way to touch back in to that experience. And what I also tell folks is microdosing is not a magic pill, that we don't want to be. Ideally, we're not dependent on any endogenous drug, but that we've done enough work to cultivate a sense of presence and balance and a regulated nervous system within our everyday lives. But as you've so eloquently communicated in this podcast, it because of how sort of fucked up modernity is for real good mental health, it can take time to sort of claw back to that. And that, I think, is why psychedelics are having the moment that they are, because we are in desperate need of this type of support.
Yeah. And I'll just riff on that. There's this ideal of what it is to be a healthy person that it feels to me is, you buy a 20-acre farm somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and you're completely self-sufficient, and you have, crystal clear running water from a spring, and you're raising all of your food, and you don't watch the TV. And the reality of it is that's not most people's lives. And especially if you're still a participant in modern society, right? If you're trying to learn and engage with others, that's not your reality, which means you're always making concessions. You're always going to be sacrificing one of the core variables. So you're not going to have perfect sleep, not going to get perfect amount of exercise because you have to go to your job, and your job may require you to sit in a cubicle for 8 hours a day. And it's so unreasonable for people to say, well, just quit that job and go live out in the countryside. So what we say is we are all of us making concessions away from what we know is optimal for health. And just like, I guess my approach would be towards supplementation with protein powder or anything that, we'd say you should get it from your diet. Yeah, you should. And also, I'm a realist, and I understand that if you want to live in the modern world, you are going to be taking a hit in one way, shape, or another. So I think that's one of the things that psychedelics can do for people. The liability is, and I'm sure you've seen this, I've seen this a lot, people who have an incredibly unhealthy lifestyle. This is especially the case, I feel like, for people who are a little bit workaholic, sometimes very successful financially, but they're just burning that candle at both ends. And they're imbalanced, their relationships are suffering. And then they say, well, I'm going to go out and I'm going to do some psychedelics, get my head right, and then come right back in. And that's just like, I would say, you shouldn't eat a junk diet and think that taking some supplements are going to fix it for you. That's not a good strategy. And so I think that, the microdosing is interesting because it can provide potentially some longer term sustainable benefit. By and large, the research I've seen is so much less in terms of microdosing and the benefits. There are a couple of studies. The best of them, I guess, would be Paul Stamets' kind of combination study. But there's very little
research. It's still
research.
very nascent. I mean, all the research is very, very nascent for
correct. Versus still, macrodosing, set and setting, protocolized versions, well established that we know, not necessarily at the level of what we'd see for cardiovascular drugs, clinical trials, but it seems relatively safe. It seems quite effective when done in that way. So point here, I guess, would be I'm very optimistic on what we can continue to learn. Microdosing may be one of the strategies that enable people to do kind of little bumps into, reminding them. Maybe it even becomes something like a supplement where we say, look, in the modern world, if we're going to go out and do all this stuff we're going to do, we actually do need to bias our biology a little bit closer to connection. And this is one way to do it. But I think we're still at the stage where the liability in saying that's a good plan is that people say, oh, this is well established. I don't have to change anything. I can just use the little psychedelic and bypass all the work that's necessary to understand why I'm feeling so bad.
Right. And that's why I often say if people are only microdosing, then it can lead to bypassing, or it can lead to not getting really to the root cause. And then microdosing just becomes another, Prozac or Zoloft, another SSRI in some ways, where it's just a maintenance modality, but there's never this sort of depth that one is able to really dive into. Okay, I am mindful of time, and there's sort of one burning question that I still want to open up for you,
Sure.
and that's specific to the research in ayahuasca, because A, I'm curious why ayahuasca specifically, but B, why ayahuasca specifically in the context of detoxification, because whenever I've worked with ayahuasca myself or talked with other friends, we are aware of the purgative effects of ayahuasca, vomiting and diarrhea, and there's a lot that comes out. We're also aware of, before you go and drink ayahuasca, it's often recommended that you do a dieta, so you don't watch violent TV or music, or you cut out all oils or refined grains or sugars or certain red meats like pork and beef. So I just be curious from to hear a little bit about the research that you're doing. Why choose ayahuasca specifically? Why not ketamine or MDMA or psilocybin or 5-MeO? What do you think that's having, and how does that relate to maybe what we've talked about with detox and inflammation?
Yeah, great questions. I mean, I would be interested in exploring really any psychedelic. I think what makes ayahuasca a little bit different is it's a combination of basically plants, and it has these GI effects. And so to take a step back here, what interests me and what I don't think we know yet is, why do psychedelics work? And I think if we can better understand the answer to that question, it changes the calculus in terms of the degree to which federal government, clinicians, the general public would value psychedelics. Psychedelics, I think right now, are still seen as valuable because of their potential psychological benefit. And not to discount from that, because it is very significant. But clearly other things happen in the body when you use psychedelics, which is why, for example, we're now looking at psychedelics, meaning researchers, for autoimmune diseases or for Alzheimer's disease, right? These are not mental health states necessarily. These are molecules that we ingest that have all these pluripotent effects on pathways throughout our bodies. So why ayahuasca is, I've been doing for the last couple of years a lot of research on polyphenols. Polyphenols are nutrients found in plants. They're about 8,000, and they're thought to carry a lot of the health value of eating certain foods. So they're not macros, so they're not fats, carbs, or proteins. They're not micronutrients, not vitamins or minerals. But when people consume polyphenols, they seem to receive benefits to mental health, to cognitive health, and polyphenols are signaling molecules within plants. Polyphenols are used by plants as immune molecules to create their own microbiomes, to fight against UV radiation. And there's this question kind of about, well, if you expand this conversation and don't just say, well, psychedelics are over here and food is over here, and instead say, there are these families of nutrients or molecules found across all these different kingdoms. So fungi, but in this case, we're talking about plants, that influence human physiology. How do they do so? So
this is like the Michael Pollan question in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
It's how they botany of desire and the omnivore's dilemma, and then eventually how to change your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So ayahuasca, a little different, even though DMT is kind of the active molecule, but the mechanisms seem like they're a little less clear than even psilocybin, in part because you have a combination, right? So you have this monoamine oxidase inhibitor along with the DMT. So proposed pathways, serotonin, glutamate, dopamine, neuroplasticity, immune effects. There's all these different opportunities to understand what is happening there. The areas that we're most excited about are going to be around epigenetics and the microbiome. And again, from some of the previous research I've done and actually just published back in November, what we found is that nutrients within plants may influence the way our genes are being used. So it's not changing our DNA, but it's changing the way that DNA is being read by our bodies. And therefore, it's even more important potentially than the DNA itself, because it's saying, okay, here is the kind of code that is going to be translated into a protein. So if nutrients in plants can influence epigenetics, that would help us to understand why certain dietary patterns have long-term benefits to our health. In the context of psychedelics, one of the things that really interested me was this question of how we get enduring effects from a single dose of psychedelics. And so this is research from Anthony Bossis and others, NYU, Hopkins, showing that in end-of-life depression, so these were people kind of with terminal diagnoses, that a single dose of psilocybin had mental health benefits that lasted years. So that doesn't jive with kind of the serotonin pathway. You can't really modify serotonin. Serotonin, is not a pathway that a single anything is going to mess with for that amount of time. So it indicates something has to happen at a deeper level. And the two candidate pathways were, for us at least, epigenetics, meaning changing the way the DNA is used, and then the microbiome, because we know if you change the microbiome, you change the immune system. Change the immune system, you have all these different pathways within the body and within the brain. And so we wanted to look at kind of this combination of things within ayahuasca. Additionally, we have kind of the lead on this study, whose name is Peyton Fulstead. She's a medical student. This was a domain of interest that she was really passionate about. So the goal here was, or is, to take people who are using ayahuasca to measure their epigenetics and their microbiome before and after an intervention here with ayahuasca, to see whether changes in their genetic expression and changes in their microbiome can help us to understand who gets benefit and who does not. That's really, really interesting stuff. It builds on the work of Dave Rabin, Candace Lewis, and others, where they looked at a similar kind of setup in terms of a small subset of epigenetics for people using MDMA. And what they found is that changes in epigenetics predicted who had a benefit from it. So that's really what we're looking at here. And again, there's a lot that is unknown about exactly what we'll find. But we think there's a higher chance of finding something with ayahuasca, because not only do you get, the combination of these two very potent MAOI and DMT pathways, but you also get the polyphenols that are in this brew. And you're going to get the higher chances of microbiome changes because of the known GI effects. So we've already actually captured some super interesting data that Peyton will be presenting at a conference in Seattle coming up soon. And then we're expanding this study now. And I'm incredibly optimistic about some of the stuff that we're going to be finding. So you'll be hearing more from that, I'm sure, from me and others pretty soon.
That's exciting. It's reminding me of two things. Years ago, 2016, almost 9 years ago, I went to an ayahuasca conference in Romania, of all places. And there was a presenter there. I think his name is Slocum, David Slocum something. He has a retreat center in Peru. And he did a study comparing people who honored the dieta, meaning they properly prepared and did the full dieta, versus those who didn't, and showing that those who actually did the dieta had much more substantial or beneficial outcomes compared to those who did not do the dieta. And I think that's also another interesting angle here. And I'd be curious to hear, are you controlling for that variable as part of this research, or not necessarily?
Not in this preliminary study. So this is an early study. It's the first study of its shape that's ever happened. I mean, the other thing about it that makes it interesting is that we're really trying to kind of self-fund it. So we're taking donations from people who are also interested in this. And we're basically doing this a little bit piecemeal, because we're doing these labs along with the donations. So this is not some sort of a major NIH academic center that's funding it. This is just a team of people. Like, I'm just volunteering to help with this because I'm super passionate about it. But what you bring up is, sure, different phases, taking this research further. Is it what people consume ahead of time? Is it what people consume afterwards? But to really do this well, you would need a randomized trial, and the cost of something like that, including kind of like the legal ramifications and government oversight necessary at this stage, it's far too much.
Yeah, and I can imagine other variables as well, like the specific shaman that you're sitting with, or curandero, the Icaros that they're singing as part of the ceremony, where the the brew comes from. Is it, from Hawaii or the deep Amazon? There are also 5 or 6 different types of ayahuasca, and it sounds like that would all be fun and great. But for now, start at the most relevant thing and the most important thing, and generate momentum on that, and then see where you go from there. And I think it's fascinating. I think this is the impact of psychedelics on autoimmune conditions. I first learned about it through Joe Tafur and Fellowship at the River when I read that. But I think the deeper I get into it, the more potential I see there being. And I'm really excited for that, most particularly sort of that line of research. It's great what we've found about depression and addiction and anxiety, but for autoimmune conditions, if it could help to address a lot of these, that would be phenomenal, like really phenomenal for so many people.
Totally agree.
Well, Austin, this has been fun. You're so eloquent and well-spoken. This has been like a favorite podcast that I've done in some time. This is going to be one that folks not only will share, but I think will listen to 2 or 3 times because of the depth and the articulation that you're able to bring to a topic, and something we haven't talked much about on the podcast. So I appreciate you joining us and sharing so generously. If folks want to learn more about your work, what you're up to, where should we send them? Do you have a website? I imagine you have a social, the book that you wrote. What are good next steps?
Yeah, I have a website. It's austinperlmutter.com. My social is Dr. Austin Perlmutter. I'd say those are probably the best places to start to learn more. I've done a lot of presentations at various conferences and stuff around psychedelics, and I've written a bunch of blogs on it too. So if you look on Psychology Today or Medium or other places, or you can just go to my website, you can see some of my thinking around that.
Fantastic. Well, Austin, thank you again for joining us for the podcast. It was really great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for watching. If you want to grow your own medicine from microdosing or high-dose experiences, check out our Mushroom Grow Kit. It's the simplest way to get a reliable source of high-quality mushrooms, and it includes detailed videos walking you through the entire process. No guessing, just clear instructions for best results. Check out the link in the description below.